all. Today I'm going to discuss something a bit unusual. In my continuing reviews of the novels of Philip K. Dick, I'm going to review the novel that he never completed and really never got past the outline stage. The Owl in Daylight was to be his last novel. He had already received an advance from his publisher, but unfortunately he passed away before he could complete it. There were several outlines. The most complete is based on a conversation that he had with a journalist friend of his named Gwen Lee on January 10th, 1982. In that discussion, he had said that the novel was going to be about a man named Ed Firmly, who was a composer of musical scores for grade B science fiction movies, and he was living a fairly decent life, but he is mugged, as it were, by aliens who have been visiting our planet for a long time, but they grew up without sound. They appreciate sound through vibration, but they particularly like classical music, but they don't hear. They're deaf. But they have a much greater visual range that can see deeper into the electromagnetic spectrum than we can. They consider us kind of blind. They consider our vision to be like the vision of a mole compared to a human. They communicate telepathically, and so they can't relate directly the experiences of what sound is or how we hear sound. But they mug Ed Firmly as a way of implanting a biochip into his brain so that they can observe his music experiences and live kind of vicariously through him. Now, this chip is supposed to remain passive. It's supposed to be in his brain, and he's not supposed to know about it. And eventually the chip becomes bored with both his schlocky, schmaltzy music compositions and the kind of crappy pop that he listens to, and becomes active, and it starts taking over, and all of a sudden he doesn't want to write these lousy pieces of music anymore. He becomes a very good avant-garde composer, and now his works are being given notice, but he's starting to lose money because making the film scores made him money, and he could afford his house and his wife and a mistress and a fancy car, and all of a sudden he becomes worried about what's he going to do about his finances. Eventually, the aliens reveal themselves, and they offer him to remove the chip, and he refuses. He likes the fact that he is now composing serious music as opposed to the garbage he was working on before. He offers to give up his life, basically, to become be transformed into a biochip, to be implanted in the brain of one of these aliens, so he can experience their world of brilliant colors that we can't see. And this will lead eventually to the death of his alien host, but he'll get to experience it. That was the primary outline. However, there was another one that he spoke to somebody else about, where it was going to be about a scientist who creates a theme park based on the experiences of his youth, and an alien artificial intelligence takes over and traps him in this theme park, where he's forced to relive certain things from his youth and the artistic and political and gay subcultures of Berkeley in the 1940s and 50s. And then he wakes up and goes back to living his life as an old man. The third idea was that a different alien named Ditheon combined the Torah and Jesus Christ into one being. And it experiences basically the levels of Dante's Inferno, being, hell, purgatory, and finally heaven. Some of these ideas were supposed to be kind of incorporated into the same, I think, plot, but they seem to be all, very separate. Obviously, he wanted to expand on some of the things he had done in Valus and the Divine Invasion, and to a lesser extent, the Transmigration of Timothy Archer, which talks about some of these same things about particularly Dante's Inferno and its meaning to modern life, that maybe he wasn't talking about three separate things. He was talking about different periods of time when the left brain when people only use their left brain, then they only use their right brain, and maybe a combination of the two of them using both spheres of the brain was the idea of heaven, at least for Philip Dick's mind. Um, Anyway, he never wrote the novel. He died, as you know, on March 2nd, 1982. That has an odd significance in. I heard an interview with his former wife, Tessa Dick, about the fact that when he said 2374 in reference to the odd experiences that he had in February and March of 1974, he wasn't using American time notation. He was using English time. So he wasn't saying February, March 1974. He was saying March 2nd, 1974. 3-2-374 was really 3-2-74 in the way Americans would write it. The significance of that, of course, is that he died of a stroke on March 2nd, 1984, 10 years later. That may be purely coincidental, but he did tell a friend that he had had a vision of his death that was provided by this strange experience he had, and that he saw a man lying sort of on his face between a sofa and a coffee table, and that's how he was discovered when he had his stroke. That was not the stroke that killed him. He died of a stroke in the hospital later. But again, that's just kind of an interesting fact. Tessa Dick wrote a self-published version in 2009 of this novel, The Owl in Daylight, and I recently read it from someone downloaded it. Philip K. Dick's estate objected to her publishing this because she did not have the rights to it and demanded that she take it down, and she did. So now finding a copy of the self-published version of The Owl in Daylight is almost impossible, and if you do find it, you're going to pay quite a lot of money for it. But there is a version that someone scanned, and I recently read it, and I quite enjoyed it, though it's not really the same, which again was her intention. She said she didn't want to write the same novel that Phil was going to write. She wanted to write a novel based on what she thought he would have done with these ideas, eventually had this novel coalesced. And I think she did a good job. It's not a perfect book. For instance, she uses the term an owl in daylight a bit too frequently. What that term means and what it meant to Philip K. Dick is someone who doesn't understand something or is blind. Of course, owls are not actually blind in daylight. They can see. They simply see better at night because of the fact that they have a special membrane in their eyes, which makes their night vision far superior to that of a human being. But they can see in daylight. Owls tend to be crepuscular. They go out at daylight and dawn, so they're really not doing anything in daylight except sleeping. But in Tessa Dick's book, she takes this character who, as I said, was going to be called Ed Firmly, and makes him into a character named Art Grimley, who is similarly a composer of schlocky B horror slasher movie soundtracks. And he is one day mugged by these sort of aliens who are kind of like giant banana slugs, and I find that interesting. I think that's something that PKT would have liked. And they implant a biochip into his brain. But actually, it's more of a creature into his brain that wraps itself around his spinal column. And again, he starts becoming disinterested in writing these crappy music scores, and instead he starts writing avant-garde and classical music, which is highly praised. But now he's worried he's trapped in a loveless marriage to a kind of a beautiful gold digger who's sort of a minor movie star, and the only person he really likes is his daughter, Angelica. That name is somewhat significant. She's kind of his angel. And he's mugged, and he goes into a coma briefly, but he comes out of it and doesn't really have any remembrance of what happened to him. He was just walking down an alleyway, and then suddenly he wakes up in the hospital. Well, this alien implant starts taking over and, kind of listening in on what he's doing, and the aliens are sort of interested. And they find out that he's going to go to the opening of this theme park where he's supposed to cut the ribbon, and it's going to be like a horror theme park based on schlocky horror movies but it's also partly based on Dante's Inferno. And the guests have to go through these, levels of hell and purgatory and heaven. Um, well, he goes to the ribbon cutting and he's getting bored. He cuts the ribbon. He's not supposed to go into any of the rooms. The park is not actually ready yet. He was just supposed to, attend the opening day ceremony. Um, so he cuts the ribbon and he sneaks into one of these rooms because he's just so sick and tired of all these like sycophants hanging around him. And, he goes into the room and he starts experiencing a version of Dante's hell. And suddenly the alien implant takes over and he goes into a coma and they can't find him for a long time and they finally find him and he's just slumped over in his wheelchair in the hospital and they can't figure out what happened to him. They take him back to the hospital, but in his mind he has gone back to his youth and apparently he failed an important math test when he was in high school and that prevented him from taking a summer job and from going out with a girl that he liked. Well, the aliens take him back, and they basically, in his mind, he becomes a different person, a guy named Tony, and he passes. They allow him to, he hears a female voice that's very lovely, and she tells him the answer to this math quiz, and test, and he passes the exam, and now he gets this job at a record store, and he's starting to make a bit of money, and now he has enough money to ask this girl out, and he does, and she reluctantly agrees, only if he'll take her out to a dance every Saturday night, and he agrees to that. Um, starts having this, relationship with her, and then a bunch series of strange things happen to him. And again, I'm not going to spoil the whole novel for you by going through it line by line, but he experiences some things that happened during the Korean War, which he didn't actually serve in real life, apparently. And he meets a couple of buddies, and then that changes, and he goes through some like kind of strange, trippy, hallucinogenic things where he actually becomes an owl. And he and this girl both become owls, and I thought that was funny. They're hunting for bugs and stuff, and talking about how good it is to eat bats and things like that. And then they switch back to become humans. And meanwhile, apparently this alien implant has a limited life. Its battery is dying, so it can't really stay with him for too long, and it starts becoming bored with him, and it leaves him, and he wakes up out of a coma, and it goes into the mind of it's looking in the hospital and doesn't realize it's in the mental ward, and it connects itself to this uh, you know kind of crazy person named Kevin Waggle, who's one of these end of the world kind of conspiracy kind of guys, and it gets into his brain and starts showing him what he thinks is the truth of that life's all a lie, and he starts putting out these message boards to say the world's coming to an end. He's standing on a corner in Berkeley and shouting and holding up placards and acting like a goof, and eventually the implant gets sick of him too. It's tired of his rhetoric and nonsense, and it leaves him. And there's a strange organization who are called the false archons, and an archon was a high priest in Greek mythology, and they are pursuing this. They want to find out what this alien chip is. They also want to stop the aliens, but they're too late. The aliens leave in their spaceship. They are going to take the recording of Ed Firmley's experience and turn it into a movie to show their own people, and they're going to make money off of it, which is funny because he's a person who makes exploitative movies, and they're exploiting his experience for their own profit. So they kind of turn the tables on him. But Ed Firmley, meanwhile, comes back out of the coma. For a while, he can't shake off these dreams, even though the implant is gone, that he's this guy, Tony. And finally, he breaks out of that with the help of a female voice and a apparent friend of his wife's called Sophia, who is this dark-haired girl he's always been seeing. The significance of the dark-haired girl in Philip K. Dick's works is perhaps people think a reference to his twin sister Jane, who died 6 weeks after she was born. He was born twin with Jane. The sad story is that unfortunately his parents were very poor. They didn't have a lot of money and they could really only afford to feed one baby. And because Phil was the stronger of the two, he was the one who was fed. And Jane basically starved to death and died 6 weeks after she was born. And he always felt a terrible loss. He felt guilty that, he should have died and she should have lived, and that he was missing someone. And therefore, this character of the dark-haired girl often appears in his work as a savior kind of a figure, and maybe that was just him, seeking out his sister. The character of Sophia is, like I said, a friend of his wife Edna, who's this, gold-digging person who slowly starts to come to realize that he has more depth than she thought, and she actually starts falling in love with him at the end of the novel. And it's in some ways too late. He doesn't really have a great relationship with her. The only person he likes is his daughter. And he starts realizing there's kind of a creepy, almost an incest thing about that, and he becomes embarrassed. But he meets this girl, Sophia, who starts telling him that, the music is the answer. Music is the truth. Music is heaven. And he should still keep writing these classical pieces. And he does, and he starts becoming praised by them. And he becomes convinced that music is the way to heal the world entirely. Meanwhile, the alien creature leaves this crazy guy, Kevin Waggle, and the Archons are looking for it, and they want to kill it. It dies on its own, but before it does, it plants its eggs into the eyes of all these homeless people at the homeless shelter where Waggle was staying, and they start saying kind of crazy, incomprehensible things. So whether that's going to do any good, we don't really know at the end of the novel. And the funny thing, and I think, again, PKD would have loved this, Art Grimley has now become, like I said, convinced that music is the way to heal the world. And he gives this big lecture to a bunch of college students about how, music is wonderful. And he's talking about the tonalities and how it'll bring them to the truth. And the lecture is very well received. And he goes out and he sees Kevin Waggle with one of these placards that says, something like that: music is heaven, music is the truth. And he hugs him and embraces him. Finally here's somebody who understands. And the Kevin Waggle says, "Hey, what are you doing? You're bending my sign." I love that. He finally meets somebody who sympathizes with him. He says, get away from me, you're bending my sign. I thought that it was very well written. It's funny. It's interesting. The characters are believable, and I like the whole thing about his other life as Tony and his wife Candy, who turn out, in fact, to be friends of his daughters who are getting married. His buddy from Korea turns out to be another friend, in his imagination, turns out to be another friend of his daughter. And again, you're left with the questions of, what is reality? Do we live in our own minds? Is everything we see just an illusion? And I like kind of the thing about the importance of music being able to help people and lift them up. I think she did that very well. And again, I think that PKD would have enjoyed the novel, her version of the novel, had he lived to see it. Sadly, he didn't. He had already left her by that time, though. Again, she says that he left her. She didn't leave him. He told people she left him, but she says he moved out and took all his furniture, and apparently that is the truth. So again, I hope that if you can find this downloaded copy, there are a couple of pages missing, but it doesn't really matter because you can fill it in from the previous text and figure out what's going on. There's a little bit about the Archons that's I didn't get, but I thought was interesting. They finally find the implant, but it's dead, of course. So they take it back and they're studying it as some kind of a laboratory, and they want to replicate it. I thought that would be interesting to do like a second, like a follow-up novel. I don't believe she did that. And she's done a couple of other fiction books, but I don't think she's gone back to this universe. They're more original. Again, being PKD's wife, she had more insight into these things than most people would. And again, if you can find it, I hope you enjoy it.